Hello and welcome to the Never Standing Still podcast. My name is Stephanie, and in this podcast episode I'll be sharing with you the story of humanitarian Lady Ryder of Warsaw, better known as Sue Ryder. 2024 marks the centenary of the birth of this remarkable woman in Yorkshire, England, yet today most people only recognise her name for her charity shops, for which she was a pioneer. A smaller amount may know someone who lived in one of her hospices, yet there is so much more to discover. Stay with me to learn about her phenomenal life, from looking after spies in the Second World War to establishing a worldwide network of homes and projects to help those that needed it, an inspiring act of remembrance in a personal mission to ease the suffering experienced in the Second World War and beyond. After we published the first episode of this podcast, I was contacted by an author who had been researching Lady Ryder's life as part of a book she was writing on a Polish agent during the Second World War. I agreed to meet with her over Zoom to find out more. Here is our conversation.
Hello, my name is Clare Mulley and I am an author and historian, and my next book will be called Agent Zoe, and it's about this truly extraordinary woman who's called Elżbieta Zawadzka, but sometimes known in England as Elizabeth Watson. That's how Sue Ryder would have known her, but best known as Zoe, hence Agent Zoe, the name of the book. So who was Zoe? Well, she was the only woman to reach Britain from Nazi-occupied Poland as an emissary of a commander of one of the armies. In her case, she was an emissary of the Polish Home Army. So she was the only female emissary to reach Britain from Nazi-occupied Poland during the war, which took her over, 1,000 miles of enemy-occupied territory, incredibly dramatic, terrifying journey. She was nearly arrested in occupied Paris. She was nearly drowned hiding in the water tender of a steam train to take her across occupied land. She was, she had to make this perilous trek over the High Pyrenees in the snowy mountains where she was shot at by border patrols. But eventually she did make it to Britain, still holding her very important microfilm. She had two sets of microfilms, one hidden in a little brass cigarette lighter and the other one hidden in the shaft of a door key. So she got this huge amount of material to Britain. And when she was in Britain, that's, of course, when she met Sue Ryder. So she arrived in Britain on May Day 1943. And she had two missions to undertake there, one of which is hugely important. She secured the legal status for women in the Polish military, in the Home Army, which meant towards the end of the war, the women, instead of just being shot or sent to concentration camps or forced labour, it was the first time Nazi Germany made female platoons, female units into prisoners of war. So therefore saving, several thousand lives just in that alone. Anyhow, and she also undertook quite a lot of training. So she was getting a bit of training herself, like parachute training and some communications training, but she was also training the Polish Special Force paramilitary, which were called the Cichociemni, which means the silent unseen. And she becomes the only female member of this elite special forces group. So she's the only Cichociemna in Polish with an A at the end. And so she is being prepared to be the only woman parachuted back from Britain to Poland during the war, where she would take part, while being hunted by the Gestapo, I should say, and her whole family was arrested, but she would take part there and play a very important strategic role in the the largest organised act of defiance against Nazi Germany during the war, which is the Warsaw Uprising. And so when she's completed her parachute training, she was sent off to Frogmore Hall to await her Special Duty Squadron flight, who are going to parachute her back behind enemy lines. She's on in a massive Halifax with two men who are jumping on the same day to the same field. And while she is waiting, she's sent over to Frogmore Hall, and that's where she met Sue Ryder.
So I've just been chatting about Sue Ryder's autobiography, Child of My Love. Sue writes in there that they met in Station 20, which is in Chalfont St Giles in Buckinghamshire. I did a little bit of Googling. Pollard's Park House. At least they stayed there together I think that must have been where she was having a parachute training.
No, she did her parachute training in a couple of places, a bit up in Scotland, but most of the work, all the work from actual aircraft, rather than they actually started off jumping from the hole in the ceiling in one of these decaying country houses where they were training up in Scotland. And then in the gardens they had this thing. It looks a bit like a small telephone pylon, sort of metal tower, and they jump from that, and then they graduate to jumping from an aircraft. And that was all. The aircraft jumps were all done from Ringway Airport, which is now Manchester Airport.
Yeah.
So that's where she did her parachute training. But yes, I mean, they were the Chicka-Chemney and agents, obviously from other countries and so on, were training at British country houses all over England and Scotland. Actually, it's very little talked about, but right in the heart of the English countryside, you have all these incredibly highly trained elite special agents in the polls where, you know, the Chicka-Chemney, the paramilitary. And, you know, nowadays we walk around these Jacobean mansions, and I know that if you go to Audley End House, you open a cupboard in the laundry, you can find a label talking about their machine guns that were stored there, and where the grenades are kept, where they were under the butler's pantry. So, you know, this other layer of history is there as well. So Zoe was part of that. But then, yes, so she met Sue Ryder and she stayed with her. And because her flight was delayed, then they stayed together, and she was allocated the spare bed in Sue's room.
Ah, I see. Okay.
So yeah, so that's, and I think there was bad weather for just over a week or something, so it was all a bit delayed. And as she was the only woman, she couldn't be expected to bunk up. They didn't want her to bunk up in the room that all the men were sharing, these shared rooms. So she stayed with Sue Ryder. And there's a lovely bit actually in Child of My Love where Sue remembers her tacking up a little picture of two women holding hands on a riverbank above her bed. But I don't think Sue ever asked her who they were, so I've had to, you know, speculate. I mean, I don't make any guesses that are unfounded, but it's interesting to imagine.
Yeah, it is, and it just, what a transient time, because that comes across. She talks about people coming and going, and obviously she was there, she was a cook, so she was catering for these people, but they were also responsible for driving them to and from training, and they, you know, it was implied that they were there to basically welcome them and give them a home for however long or short a period of time.
There were two things they were doing. They were doing all the practical stuff. So as you say, they were drivers. I mean, some of the WWII were also drivers doing the same role, but some of the families, like Sue was, in these houses, they were doing the cooking and the cleaning as well. You know, it's all of that basic stuff, laundry. But they were also playing a very important separate function, which is just trying to relax these people, trying to give them some hospitality. So, I mean, after dinner, they would come down, not in uniform, put on the radio, they might dance, they might play card games and just have conversations, you know, just trying to provide a little bit of very, very important mental support before these people are dropped back behind enemy lines. And that's, you know, that's a hugely important role. And it's clear that Sue and Zoe got on very well. You know, they had a very good friendship out there, and it was important to both of them, I think.
I think that's lovely, and I was surprised looking at more information about Zoe. She was actually quite a bit older than Sue. She was born in 1909.
1909, yeah.
Sue's born in 1923/24 or whenever. She obfuscated her date of birth for various reasons. But you know that's what, nearly 20 year age gap. So
that's right. I mean, the way Zoe would have seen it, she'd have seen this cheerful young Fanny coming up with her dark hair and a big smile. And I think what she'd have found most pleasing is, I think that Sue might have had the badge of the Polish Eagle sewn onto her uniform at one point when she was working with those troops. And so that, of course, would have meant so much to Zoe and to the men, the Polish men who were parachuting back as well. So they'd have already bonded on that. But I think, you know, they had a lot in common. And it's not just that they were both women. They were the only two women there. Well, there were other Fannies, but they were sharing a room. But Zoe was the only female parachuter there. But I think they had other things in common as well. They both had this real sense of duty and purpose. They were both deeply patriotic. They had a desperate need to ensure an Allied victory, to work towards an Allied victory. I'm not saying ensure, because of course they didn't know at that time. But they were doing all they could. Zoe was putting her life on the line repeatedly, in fact, for the entire war. So they had this, I mean, Sue talks about platonic friendships, which are very important, but I think it's that very intense platonic friendship that because they knew they were only going to know each other for a short while, because they knew that Zoe was about to parachute back and the considerable likelihood that she would be killed in the next few months, because they shared this real passion to serve, for women to serve as well, but also for everyone, for their country to use all of the resources at their disposal in the fight against this appalling criminal regime in Europe. So there's an awful lot there for them to bond over.
Of course, and also I think their religion.
Yeah.
Sue, I don't know if she was Catholic at this point, but she converts at some point in her life. I think she'd always been Christian, been a practicing Christian, but in her autobiography she talks a lot about her faith being a central part of her life. And there's a Polish icon, I can't remember the name of which one it is now, but it's on the front of her book. And
the Black Madonna.
Yes,
Czestochowa, yeah,
that's the one.
She's a very important Polish icon. And in fact, during the war, Zoe did go to see that and took some strength from seeing it. I mean, Zoe was born a Catholic. She was actually, for the first start of her life, because she was born in 1909, Poland wasn't yet independent. They only got their independence back, or they only returned to Polish independence after the First World War. And so she was actually raised in a German annexed part of Poland. So she was brought up, actually German was her first language, skills that became incredibly useful for her in the war. When she was actually, in the first couple of years of the war, she is acting as a courier going in and out of Poland, going in and out of Berlin. She was very courageous, but I think it's even more important to remember she was really, really effective. I think she was successful for lots of reasons, partly because she was born into what was then German annexed part of historical Polish territory. So her hometown of Torun was part of the German-Prussian Empire when she was born. And so her first language was German. She was also blonde and blue-eyed, all of which is quite helpful. So she was sort of born with this alias. In fact, when she was a little girl, until after the First World War, she was known as Lisa, which is the German version of Elżbieta, her Polish name. Of course, when she's in England, she's known as Elizabeth, the English version of that. And so she has this from childhood. She has learnt to have a double identity, and she can pass as a natural German very easily. Her accent is perfect, and she knows all of the German traditions and things because she was brought up with all of that. So she's not going to be caught out anywhere. So that became very useful for her, of course, when she is travelling on fake German identity papers going in and out of Berlin to smuggle military intelligence one way and money for the resistance back again. Incredibly courageous. And there are lots of times when she was nearly caught, but managed to, real blunt courage, managed to keep her cool and talk her way out of trouble, or sometimes run her way out of it. And once she had to leap from a moving train to get away. So, yeah, she's a very brave woman, but she also had these other skills and real patriotism, determination, because her country's only had independence for 20 years before Nazi Germany, and then, of course, the Soviet Russia invades 17 days later from the east. So she's desperate to fight for her country. And before the war, she trained as in the military female voluntary auxiliary, if you like. So it was called the PWK, the Women's Military Service, which was a voluntary group, not officially part of the armed forces, but they were a uniform body. So in a sense, very like the Fannies. So Sue would have, kind of recognised that it was a uniform bodied of women who were trained in and could bear arms, like the Fannies, which were unique in Britain, being a uniform group outside the British forces, because of course women in the British armed forces weren't allowed to bear arms, but the Fannies were outside of the armed forces, so they had that, which is why female special agents in Britain were recruited into the Fannies before they were sent overseas. So it's a sort of quite a similar training background, if you like, from that women's military voluntary organisation. Mm.
Yeah, and I think we've touched on it earlier, but also I think Zoe, or Elżbieta is probably the same. They were educated. So Sue was brought up, she was the youngest of a blended family. She had a much older father, and he actually died the year she signed up to the Fanny. It's in her record that she had 6 months compassionate leave. But he very much believed in the education of women, and she was quite well off. He was a chair of a brewing company. He was a gentleman farmer. They lived on two huge estates. But he believed in education and basically that she should pick a trade. So she was educated at home and then sent to boarding school, sent to Benenden, right, and encouraged to have skills, not just have wife lessons, as nice young girls from a middle class background were expected to do, expected to marry well.
Yeah.
And she's quite an unconventional person. I don't think education, she used to say that she wasn't very, very clever or very well educated or couldn't pass exams, but actually she did pass exams, and she got a catering certificate, and she got a qualification in French at Benenden School. But nursing, she had a love for nursing. She wanted to be a nurse. So that's, I think, where the Fanny connection came from. And also she could drive. So her dad was a farmer, so she was taught from a very early age to drive a tractor, to look after cows. She entered agricultural competitions with the milk and cream and cheese that she made from her own herd of cows. You know, she was only something like 12. So she had like quite a practical upbringing and was expected to be useful. Which I find quite unusual. She's quite an unconventional person, I think, in that sense. And her choice of husband, well, second husband, that's also something that has a question mark over it, is also unconventional. And Group Captain Cheshire, who was another fellow humanitarian, and he recognised in her that she was an unconventional person. And Zoe sounds like an unconventional person. It seems to me that wartime is the time when people like that, who are marginal or operate in marginal parts of society in plain sight, really have a chance to shine.
Well, I think war certainly kind of subverts the natural order of things. You know, I mean, whatever the war needs, the war will get. So it enables women to have opportunities that they wouldn't have in peacetime in this period. And that is certainly true in Poland as well. And I think you're right that Zoe is an unconventional character. But in Poland, well, she is unconventional, but Poland is a very different situation to Britain. So there has been, Poland has just been through about over 120 years of annexation and occupation by its neighbouring empires and countries. And yet there is this real strong sense of heritage, and that is passed down through several generations. And there are various uprisings. And so Zoe would have been brought up in a house where her mother would have told her, you know, her grandmother remembered pouring petrol over the cabbage patch so that German soldiers in a different era couldn't take them, you know, and how her father or her grandfather had refused to fight for one particular group because he didn't feel it was in the Polish national interest, even though there wasn't a Polish nation yet. And women also passed down generation this real, I mean, some of the women who fight say that we sucked in patriotism with our mother's milk and it was in our DNA. And so just even teaching the history to the children, the religion, the faith, because Germany was mainly Protestant, of course, but keeping the bedtime prayers, all that sort of thing. And teaching traditional songs, that kind of cultural side of it as well went down. And having said that, when Poland did get independence again after the First World War, they're very progressive in many ways. So they're one of the first countries that women are enfranchised at that point, long before most countries where women didn't have the vote for years still. And in other ways as well, I mean, they passed laws saying there's equality of opportunity for gay people in Poland at this period. It's really quite exciting. So there's a lot of this kind of, we are going to have this new society. It's going to be equal, free. You know, they get this real sense of a rebirth of a nation of real importance. And that feeds all of this great patriotism. So is less unusual in Poland in that regard, because there is this big sense of we must all play our part for our nation. You know, we're a reborn country and we will fight for it. There's a real fiery sense of patriotism and sense of keeping that independence that's so hard won. Having said that, most women were not doing military voluntary training, even in Poland. War was still seen primarily as a male world. But there had been iconic women in Polish history, like this woman Emilia Plater, who had served in previous uprisings. Some of them had dressed as men, some of them had actually been women who had gone out as medics and ended up playing a fighting role and so on. So there were these very much admired examples in Polish history. So it wasn't as unusual, I think. But still, Zoe certainly had to fight her way. And so she is a commander of this PWK, the Polish Women's Military Volunteer Group, before the war, and takes all that training with her.
And I'm interested to see that Sue keeps in touch with Elshebetta. I think she did keep in touch with people that she could. It's clear from her autobiography, but also her relief work was helping people, some people who she knew during the war, but mostly people who she was trying to help immediately after VE Day to become repatriated. She was helping young men mainly who had gone from a Nazi prison straight into a Soviet prison because they were wanted for political misdemeanors on both sides.
Sometimes just other, minor and very major crimes.
Yes, yeah. So
yes, it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, when I was researching my book on Zoe, I kind of looked into the Polish files to see what they had on Sue Ryder, and they had some really interesting stuff that I didn't find. Obviously, looked in the National Archives as well. I'm sure you. It's interesting, first of all, that when Sue had written Child of My Love, she obviously hadn't got back in touch with Zoe by the time this book was published, because she writes in here that, I think this was published in 1975 first, and she writes that she'd obviously assumed the worst. She says, Elizabeth seemed to lead a charmed existence, but her luck had to run out, for she never returned. So she clearly at that point thought that Zoe hadn't made it, and she might have heard, I don't know if she served in the Water Uprising or not, but the fatalities in that were absolutely appalling. And so it would have been a very understandable thing to imagine that's what had happened to her, so she hadn't been in touch. But in fact, her luck had run out in a different way. While in the 1950s, while Sue is doing this incredibly important work that leads on to all of her great work, Zoe has actually been arrested by the Soviet-backed communist regime. She's not in touch with everyone because she's in a cell. She was this, at the end of the war, she is demobilised as one of the most highly decorated women in Polish history, and military decorations. And yet the Soviet-backed communist regime arrests her in 1951 because she's a potential rallying point. She's a potential leader of resistance against the communist imposed regime. Sue talks about in how wonderful VE Day was. I don't know if she was in Trafalgar Square or not, was she? But she certainly talks about everyone going into the streets and dancing and how great it was. And she says, there were jubilant pealing of bells in all liberated countries. But of course, it's not the same as that got a Soviet-backed communist regime imposed on them. Poland goes basically from being occupied by the Nazis to having the Red Army come in and arrest a lot of the leading resistance fighters, a lot of the men, and then some of the women as well, including several of the women Zoe worked with and Zoe herself. And they actually tortured her in prison. They sentenced her to 10 years. I won't give the whole story. She's an incredible rallying point in prison as well. She's, as you would imagine, she's an amazing woman. So that's probably why she's not in touch with Sue at this point. But then when I was researching what the Polish files on Sue Ryder, it's really interesting because they actually think that these homes and the refuges that Sue is setting up, they think it's all a front for espionage for the British MI6 or the British government finding out what's going on behind the Iron Curtain, so-called. And there's various files on her, various sort of operations that they do to try and find out information about her. I think I've got somewhere they gave it quite a funny name. I think they called it Operation Philanthropist or something like that.
I mean, she did know. I've heard recordings of her talking, and she knew she was being watched, and she was told actually. I can't remember which agency, but it was an international agency. She was told when she wanted to leave the Fanny and do relief work in Poland that she couldn't because of her work supporting SOE operatives. She was told that she wouldn't be welcome, but she was persistent, and she did some work in France, and she did some work in Germany, and then she did start driving into Poland helping prisoners, visiting prisoners, and she visited them up until they were all dead, basically. And
amazing.
It is amazing. And she had gifts in her van that she would use to bribe a minimal prison guards to let her go in there. And really, she was going and talking to these people really to help them keep their spirits up more than anything else. I mean, she was starting off trying to help them get papers for citizenship, because these were people whose entire families had been obliterated in the Holocaust, and they had no papers and they had no evidence of where they'd come from because it had gone. And the people who could corroborate them had gone. And, that they had nothing, so that they were going from one prison to another. So understandably, these people are suicidal. They're desperate.
And a number of them are also, she does all that prison work early on where they have been arrested. And, there's that awful note that she's passed by some lad who's due to be executed, and he wants it given to his father. And he entrusts it to Sue, and it says, in a few short hours, I'll be taken to a place of execution. We must die at the hands of our allies for shooting the SS who killed our families. So it's like, obviously the war ends officially, but there's a huge amount of firearms around. There are desperate people who have suffered deep trauma, and obviously have opportunities either for revenge or self-defense perhaps, or all sorts of things. The circumstances there are extraordinary, and she's right in the thick of it, trying to, and in fact effectively, I think, rescued a number of these people from potential execution.
Yeah, she did, and she had holiday camps. So she called them, we think of camp now as say Butlins or something like that, but no, it was holiday homes. So it started off, she rented a wing off a friend who owned a hall, Melford Hall in Suffolk. She was a Suffolk girl, so well connected with the people who had big houses in that area of the world. And she rented a wing of Melford Hall, and that was the first holiday home. So she would get in Britain, I think there'd been one in Denmark and maybe one in Germany before this, but this was the first one in Britain. And she would get survivors of the Holocaust there for 2 weeks, 3 weeks holiday. And I think as that generation were getting older and getting health conditions, or already had health conditions from the things that they'd experienced in war, that's where her work evolves. So that's where the hospice work comes in. So in Poland and in Germany, she first off has places for these young men predominantly to live who are stateless people, refugees. But then she sets up a home for young girls with rheumatoid arthritis in Poland. There are people who are suffering from cancer treatment. So she does a lot of work helping people with those diagnoses, either end-of-life care or cancer curing, for want of a better word, treatment centres. A big one opens up in Italy. So she kind of follows them. She follows them through their lives, and she's with these people until that generation has gone. But by that point, other people are also using these services for hospice care or for disability services. But mainly it specialises in hospice care and end-of-life care. But that's that thread, like why she starts off in the refugee world and then ends in the social care world as we understand it in this country. That's how that happened.
Which takes us up to the 1980s, really, which is 1983 is when Sue and Zoe are reunited in Britain. It's amazing. Just so lovely.
Yes, and they go to celebrate Leonard and Sue's silver wedding in Rome in 1984.
Yeah, so, obviously, in Poland, they've been through this roller coaster of the communist regime. There are organisations of resistance within Poland, which Zoe is involved with to some degree. She never gives up the fight for true Polish freedom. And she'd been arrested again in 1976 and arrested again after that. And she's still working. She's working with various aims. One of them is to preserve a record of the people from her home area of Poland, Pomerania, and also of women, all the service women, because there are some records, but no one's really sort of paying any attention to the role played by women. And we're talking 40,000 women, huge numbers, very significant role, and mainly working in communications and intelligence, which is one of Poland's great contributions to the war, but actually also working with gun in hand, doing sabotage. Some of them were doing assassinations, blowing up trains, so all different roles. And that hadn't been recorded. So, and it's, of course, incredibly dangerous to keep records of anything during the Second World War, because the communist regime has a very different history they've been trying to tell, which is about how basically the communists saved the day, the Red Army liberated Poland, which is true to a degree, but the spin on it is very different. So she's trying to preserve this other perspective on the history, which is now the history that we know. all of which is very dangerous and gets her arrested several times. And eventually they end up with martial law in Poland. And again, arresting people in Zoe's circle, and she's supporting them and so on. And then martial law is lifted in 1983, and immediately she's out the door. She's testing the limits of her liberty, official liberty. So she's off to Czechoslovakia and Hungary, and she's getting in touch with various people. One of the other things she's doing, she is getting medals. So the Polish government in exile, Poland's government got out in 1939 through Romania, through France, in Angers, set up base there, and then eventually went with the fall of France, got to Britain, and they've been operating in Britain ever since, although they weren't recognised towards the end of the war, that everyone stops recognising and recognises the communist-backed regime. But they're still in situ in London, and they are still issuing medals. And so she is sending them lists of all the women who should also be honoured, and then delivering medals to these women in Poland, again, incredibly risky, and overseas as well. And so she comes out again with this big list of people, the latest update. And she gets in touch with Sue, obviously thinking, oh, perhaps she can help her with London contacts, with British contacts. And so Sue invites her out, 1983, same year that martial law is lifted. She's still got that ability to travel at that point. So I think Sue's quite surprised when she finally arrives at Cavendish, Sue's beautiful Suffolk home. She finds that there's at least 30 other Poles already there. It's just fantastic, that these are some of the women, some of the people that Sue Ryder's been supporting.
I don't know if you've been to Cavendish, but the churchyard, the churchyard is phenomenal, because Leonard and Sue are buried there, and they're buried surrounded by Polish people who they lived with at Cavendish. It just shows you kind of, they talk the talk, but they walk the walk. And there's another chap who's buried there called Stefan Burton. I don't know if you know about the story of Stefan, but he was a political prisoner, and when he was released, he ends up moving to Cavendish and living in this community with Sue and her family. And whilst he's there, he's an old man. When he got there, he couldn't forget his girlfriend. He had a girlfriend in Poland. The community there, they helped him find her. They find her. She's still unmarried. She's an old lady. They get her to Cavendish and they get married. And I've seen the wedding photographs of this old couple getting married, and they live very happily together at Cavendish. And I just think
that's really moving.
Yeah, it's a really moving story, and it just goes to show how, these people, they sound fantastic. They do all these brave things, but actually they were normal people. Yeah. So just phenomenal. So I think that community was a really special, unusual place, and also very Polish, because I think Sue considered herself to be Polish.
Just getting Lady Baroness, Lady Ryder of Warsaw.
Yeah.
That was very controversial. They had to have the sign off from the Prime Minister and the Queen as well.
Yes.
And the whole establishment were like, this is appalling, this is preposterous, how can you have an honour and then have an overseas country? But she's not going to be put off, thank you. She likes it. I mean, that's something they share. They are very determined women. When they've decided on something, they are going to see it through.
Yeah, so, just wonderful. But I think the house, Cavendish, is a care home again, which I think is also nice.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't for a while. I think it was kind of in limbo, but it is again now. So it's still that kind of place of care, and where people are living in a community, which I think is lovely, because that was obviously something she very much believed in, and she brought up her family there. Her and her husband and her 2 children lived in a small flat. They didn't live in the whole house, and it was home to these people, disabled people who needed care, but also the foundation headquarters. So it must have been a very strange place to live and grow up. I think about their children. I mean, what an environment.
Her daughter wrote an intro. There's a new biography of Sue Ryder, which I must admit I haven't. Well, anyhow, I have read the introduction by her daughter, and she talks about eating their meals on a folding table on the landing upstairs. I mean, they're obviously not in a massive space in this little, few rooms for the family upstairs. But then in a sense, it also gave them so much, because she also talks about playing cricket in the evenings with everyone. So they had this wider family really as well.
I mentioned briefly Family Week in 1984, which is where they both met again. So a little bit of context for Family Week. So Family Week, when Sue Ryder and Leonard Cheshire talked about family. They talked about their humanitarian work, their respective charitable foundations, and that they weren't the same organisation, but they were allied in a lot of things that they were trying to do, which was to basically remember all the life lost during the Second World War, and as an act of remembrance to try and make life better, contemporary life better, as an act of remembrance to kind of try and ensure that it would never happen again. So all very noble aims. And that they were both very invested in this idea of the human family. Like, it didn't matter what background you had, what religion you had, what political orientation you had. We were all human beings, and that was something that was a positive force. So they used to have these big gatherings. They were like rallies where residents of their respective homes, people involved all over the world, would meet together, usually somewhere in the UK, and they would have a week just talking about the charities, the work, their aims, what they'd achieved, common philosophical tenets behind all that, and just to basically share life and have a nice time, have a party. Those that were religious would go and have a mass or go to church together, and people would travel and they would go and do tourist trips here and there and just learn about each other's lives and make friends. And international marriages would happen, like people would meet and fall in love and get married. Friendships that went on for these people's lives were enduring, and they'd meet at these events. And they decide, because their work suddenly goes extremely international in the 70s and 80s, they decide that they're going to have one of these family weeks abroad, and they pick Rome. And I think that's because they're both practicing Catholics, and they want to go and see the Pope, and they want to get everybody blessed by the Pope, which is what they achieve. And also the Pope is Polish man, isn't he?
He is. And he's hugely important in Poland. He's a real rallying point. He's a real figure of inspiration to Poles. So yes, he's a Catholic. He was Polish born. He had actually been in Warsaw during the war and had been involved in some resistance work. Eventually he got out. He then becomes very important in Poland, and he returns later and becomes this real figurehead for a push for independence. I mean, he visits later, he doesn't return permanently, but he comes to Poland, and he's the first Pope from Poland, and to come back into the country. And it draws international light on the situation in Poland, but also within Poland itself. It's very important to bring a lot of these people who've been struggling for resistance or feeling the need to have a coordinated movement. It helps bring them all together. And so for Zoe, it's hugely important for her to meet the Pope and to go out there with Sue. And she writes wonderfully about it. Afterwards, she sent a thank you letter to Sue and talks about the privilege of meeting our Holy Father, but also the sights of the Eternal City, the beauty of the Alps, the whole atmosphere of coming together. She says it was a truly great and happy occasion. And when she goes back to Poland, she takes this sense within her. It's another really important motivation for her. When she goes back, it's right at the heart of where she is. And she continues to fight for Polish independence, and she supports the Solidarność movement. And of course, it's not until 1989, but she's been fighting all this time for independence and for all sorts of things. She's fighting also for remembrance, for Let's Not Forget. So she's doing memorials to people who had never been recognised by the state. And because she can't have these memorials put up in public places that is owned by the state, she gets them put up inside churchyards of Catholic churches. So there is this real sense of the church playing a sort of practical role as well. And when some of these memorials are unveiled, I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of people turn up to see it. So it's political is aligned with that whole sense as well. And so, yes, so her visit to Italy, to the Vatican with Sue is part of that whole story in the fight for resistance and freedom of Poland as well.
Yeah, I was interested to see in Sue's book that she says there were 22 women and one man who had been Polish couriers who she invites to Family Week. So she's obviously in touch with these 23 people, and they must be involved in the work in some way. Either she's visiting them because she has friends in Poland who she stays with, not just in Poland, in Germany, everywhere. As she drives over, she stays with friends as she goes along, to do very basic things like use the bathroom, have a wash, have a bit of a sleep, because she drives through the night. So she's obviously keeping in touch with this huge network across Europe.
It's like a courier route of her own, isn't it?
Yeah.
A version, because of course that's how they operated. They had a number of safe houses at their caller on the way, where they knew they could get sleep, food without questions. Everyone talking about it. So yeah.
So I do wonder who those 23 people were.
Can't help you with that, I'm afraid. Well, I can tell you one of them is Zoe. That's one woman. But as far as I'm aware, Sue never stayed with Zoe in Poland, so they didn't have a return visit. I believe that. I mean, they obviously stayed in touch. They exchanged letters afterwards. We have a lot of her correspondence post-war, a little bit earlier, but after the war, she did this secret work trying to pull together testimonies of the women who served. And a lot of it is just written on the backs of envelopes in her very spidery writing. And some of it is typed, but a lot of it isn't, because she obviously, keeping these records was incredibly dangerous. And friends of hers would donate cupboards to her, because in the communist period, you could only have so much furniture. You'd have like a ration card basically for it, that sort of thing. So you could have your standard, because she's not a woman with money, so she could have her standard bed, her standard cupboard. And then, a friend would die, or there would be another friend who knew someone who had an extra cupboard. And so her little tiny communist era flat on the 8th or 9th floor of this modern concrete block was just filled with cupboards, filled with the names of people, files, bits of photographs, occasionally some original material, resistance newspapers, but mainly she was just writing to everyone saying, trying to triangulate as well. So can you give me exactly precisely where you were at this point, where you went on, who you were coordinating, who were you reporting to, what were your routes or whatever, working it all out. And then she could see, okay, well, this person disappears at that point, so they're connected there. And building up this history from scratch, absolutely extraordinary work.
Where is that now?
Well, it still exists. It's absolutely fantastic. So it was obviously had to be kept secret right until 1989. Some people did know about it, of course, and she had lots of volunteer helpers supporting her. But it was all in her flat until then. And then after Poland regained its freedom, she'd done work with Solidarity. And she was friends, actually, with a gentleman I interviewed who was Lech Wałęsa's first press secretary, kind of like the Alistair Campbell of the time, I suppose. And he had actually interviewed her. But when he was recording her, he started off these interviews with her before communism fell, but finished them in 1991. So they kind of go through. But I interviewed him in Gdansk, where he lives, in the World War II Museum there. We met up. And halfway through, he said, "Oh, would you like to hear her voice?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course." And he got out an old tape deck, and it still had the Solidarity sticker, very worn, stuck on one side. And he put in a tape, and we could hear her, I don't speak Polish, so that has been a bit of a nightmare. But anyhow, he was doing some translation, but I could hear the tone of her voice and her banging on the table at one point. And then that tape ended, and this huge martial music just blared out. Everyone in the cafe kind of jumped. I said, "Oh, what was that?" And he said, "Oh, well, when he was first started recording her, it was illegal. And so it was illegal actually to have a tape deck that you could record on," he told me. So that one had been sent in from a friend in Japan. And he got tapes. He found the best tapes to put a bit of sellotape on and record over were the tapes of the communist regime. They were the best quality. So he literally recorded the voice, the testimony of a resistor over the propaganda of the regime. All now in an archive in Toron, in her hometown, which is run by her cousin, her niece, actually. They considered themselves niece and aunt, but it was her cousin, Dorota Zawaka-Wakaresi.
Oh, wonderful. That's good to know. Because this is the stuff that people are going to be looking at in future generations, and just, trying to piece together what is still actually just about in living knowledge still these days.
Yes, I was very lucky to interview a number of people. I miss Zoe. She lived till 2 weeks shy of her centenary, but she died in 2009. But I interviewed a number of people, a couple of veterans who remembered her. And that's how I first came across her. I was interviewing a veteran of the Warsaw Uprising at an event at the Polish Embassy. And she said, at the end of that, because we talked about another woman I'd written about, the incredible woman called Christina Skarbek, or Christine Granville. And then she said, but what about Zoe? And I was like, "Oh, who's Zoe?" And she said, "Oh, my goodness, she was the most important, Zoe ended up a general. There's only been 2 women generals in Polish history, and Zoe was one. So yeah, so it is living history. I interviewed a woman who shared her cell in prison and so on. But the human coast, it's eroding, and it is really important to try and capture some of these. And the letters, the testimonies that Zoe did, often interviewing friends, they're quite informal, but you can sense their emotion in it. You can sense as well as the facts. She was deliberately trying to work out facts that overlap with each other so that she could see that things came from more than one source. She was trying to be she was. She, after the war, also had a career as a professor of adult education and distance learning. She basically she was trying to replicate the Open University in Poland. She did an awful lot of correspondence work, radio learning, TV as a medium and so on. She's very pioneering in that as well. So she was bringing all of that analytical stuff to doing this archive as well. So although it's largely handwritten, it's very professional in many ways as well. It's a brilliant resource. But we are losing that. And this archive of Zoe's, which is largely women, but it's got a lot of the male resistors as well. It's in desperate need of state funding. They need to digitise a lot of it. A lot of it is still these very thin bits of paper. And they're doing wonderful work there, but it doesn't have the resources that the main World War II archives have. It's still seen as periphery, and yet these women were at the heart of the resistance story. So.
Well, it sounds like a fascinating book. Let's talk a little bit about when your book's coming out.
Oh, thank you. It's published on the 16th of May in Britain, later this year in America, and in Poland next year. And I hope that we'll get some more translations as well. So I'm very excited.
I'm looking forward to reading it. It sounds fascinating. I hope that you enjoyed my conversation with Clare. We spent a fascinating hour together exploring the history of Zoe and Sue. I thought now would be a good time to talk a little bit more about the topics we covered in our conversation. As we explored in episode 1 of the podcast, Sue was serving with the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry in Italy when peace came, and was posted back to the Polish canteen at Fair Milehead near Edinburgh in 1945. She was demobbed that year in consequence of taking up relief work abroad. But what did this mean in reality? In her own words from a recording from the archives, Sue explains.
And after those very poignant and very difficult years in SOE, which would be very difficult indeed to describe, if not impossible, because of the secrecy, I went on to do relief work. We were working in the ruins in different parts of Europe, and one night I came across a barn with a nurse, and the barn was illuminated by a hurricane lamp. At the far end of this barn, there appeared to be a woman perhaps in her 70s. Actually, she was only 37. And she was dying of typhus and TB. And during the course of the night, she told me her story of how before the war, she'd been living and working as a teacher in Prague, Czechoslovakia. And then she had joined the resistance. But before then, her husband and children had been taken away from her and disappeared. And she had led, at great risk to herself, escaping British and Commonwealth prisoners of war to safety at night. A most unenviable task, because it was through the mountains and often at great, great risk. Finally, she'd been caught by the Gestapo, and after undergoing frightful interrogations and tortures, she'd survived solitary confinement and no less than 3 or 4 extermination camps. When I saw her and was trying to care for those in the barn during that night, she told me briefly of her story. And it was quite clear from her great dignity, even her sense of humor and her composure, in those indescribable conditions, of how she had given a great example to those whom she had been with, both in the prisons and in the extermination camps. And so, for me, Anna illustrates the many millions who died. And you have given me this opportunity of mentioning Anna's and of all the other Annas who remain anonymous. The work has passed through different stages And after relief work, which was very hard, we had no water, there was often very little or no food, no electricity, no public services, no gas, nothing. It was this terrific courage and optimism, despite the freezing climates, 20 degrees below zero, and then the contrast of the intense heat of the summers, that really made one feel very privileged indeed to take part and be alongside and with them. And so when other relief organizations withdrew, I decided that I would stay on and try and do my best and continue to share those conditions with the men, women and children in different parts of Europe. And gradually the foundation came to be born.
At this point, it is worth exploring more about the origins of what Sue called the Foundation. The first name for her work was the Forgotten Allies Trust, but before this, from 1945 to 1952, Sue was doing relief work with the Amis Volontaires Français, the Red Cross and the Guide International Service. Work in France introduced her to French deportees released from the Dachau and Buchenwald camps. International agencies, including those Sue worked for, continued to try and repatriate displaced persons, as they became known, up to 1952. The German federal government committed funds to recompense German and Jewish victims of the Nazi regime, but around 1,000 men and women, these forgotten allies, remained, living in camps in Hanover and Baden-Württemberg. Agencies pulled out, but Sue stayed behind, trying to help. People were chronically ill and often with mental health problems as a result of trauma, and they couldn't or were not permitted to work. The Hanover camps had previously been the buildings of Neuengamme concentration camp and had changed little in essentials since they were used to house slave labour gangs. Sue tried to break the monotony of these restricted lives by bringing gifts of food, clothing, and things for their rooms. She helped sort out personal problems and organised holiday schemes in countries outside Germany to try and break up the monotony of life in the camps. The first holidays were to Denmark. With the help of Suni Sando, former resistance worker in France, and herself a survivor of Ravensbrück concentration camp, and the Danish Resistance Committee, 55 people were able to holiday there. In the 1950s, Sue wanted to set up a similar scheme in England. She returned to London and contacted people she knew from the Retired Refugees Defence Committee. These were influential people. For example, Sir Clifford Heathcote-Smith had been Vice Chairman of the Migration Council, and he became the first chair of the UK Holiday Scheme, or the Forgotten Allies Friendship Fund as it became known. First holidays were spent in a variety of places, including the Butlins camp at Clacton-on-Sea in Essex, Leonard Cheshire Homes at Ampthill Park near Bedford, and Staunton Harold Hall in Leicestershire, houses belonging to the Ockenden Venture in Woking, and even Surrey County Council's Education Centre, Glyn House in Ewell, thanks to Rotary International. Incidentally, it is this introduction at Ampthill Park where Sue met Group Captain Leonard Cheshire for the first time, who she went on to work with and then marry in 1959. People coming to England for a holiday were driven by Sue herself. She used the Ockenden Ventures Utibus Jeremiah, loaned by founder Joyce Pierce, and drove non-stop across Europe and back, fueled by coffee and biscuits. Sometimes she drove her own Austin A30 called Alice, itself a gift from refugee charity Wings of Friendship, but this was more likely to be on further trips bringing food, clothing and friendship to forgotten allies living in Europe, in camps, private homes and prisons, who Sue continued to visit up to the end of their lives. The first UK home was set up in her mother's house in Cavendish, Suffolk, where Sue Ryder and her mother lived with the community that established itself there. In these memories of Cavendish, Lady Ryder of Walsall Memorial Trust trustee Michael Cutting explains.
So really, we lived opposite Lady Ryder. I moved there in 1960 and we lived opposite her in Cavendish. And my father ran the local shop and local wholesale business, so he actually supplied the home. And when we first moved there in 1960, I should have checked. I think the home there was initially started in about 52, 53, maybe even 54. So it was still very much relying on volunteers. And my mother was a volunteer cook. I think there was someone in charge of the kitchen, and then there was a rota from various people in the village and outside the village who would go over and help cook lunch one day and so on. And then my father supplied the home with the catering, and there's one little story that I'd like to tell where Lady Ryder mentions in her book that her accountant was a retired school teacher called Mr. Ince, who was extremely dedicated volunteer, and she says she used to have to tell him to go home in the evening, and he used to reply, "I can't go home, I've got a difference of threepence in my accounts." And on many occasions, Mr. Ince would come over to our house between 7 and 8 o'clock in the evening, knock on the door to see my father, bringing one of my father's invoices, and he, with a discrepancy that he had found, and I remember on many occasions it being a penny, and I think my father even said on one occasion it was a halfpenny. Our house was actually above the shop. We had a big attic above the shop and our house. And we gave that to Lady Ryder to store all the clothes that were donated to her for Poland. And there was another elderly lady called Mrs. Macmillan who spent hours in the attic sorting out these boxes of clothes and actually repairing the clothes painstakingly in front of a very small window. I can remember her sewing up holes in garments and stuff, and then she put them in boxes ready to be transferred to Poland. And I can recall on one occasion, because I was often at school, seeing the famous Joshua truck leaving for Poland, and it was so overloaded you wouldn't have thought it would have got down to the end of the road. It really seemed to be a struggle to get the thing to move. And Sue Ryder was behind the wheel, and she was so a diminutive figure you could only just about see her, and you really wondered how that truck was going to make its journey all the way to Poland. My abiding memory was of the care and dedication that her and the wonderful body of volunteers that she managed to attract in looking after these people. Most of them in those days were concentration camp survivors. Some were disabled, but even at that age I can remember most of them were I think, mentally traumatised would be the best way of putting it. So it really was quite an eye-opener to go over there and see these people, and it was good to know that they were being looked after.
It is worth remembering that in the early days of the Foundation, Britain was still recuperating physically and financially from the Second World War. Life was hard, and people didn't have much money. Sue was known for living frugally, and money was tight at her charity too. Nurse Margaret Kurtz shares what that was like.
So I wrote to her, and she asked me if I could meet her in London. So I went to London, and she, of course, was at Leonard Cheshire's headquarters. And he had a great sense of humour, and he made some joke, and I didn't understand it. He's always making jokes. I didn't get his joke, and I thought, oh, well, I won't get the job then. But in fact, she said, well, we're just about to bring some concentration camp survivors over from Germany, and as such they couldn't go back to Poland because most of them had no relatives left there, and even if they had, they couldn't really land themselves on their relatives. And so Sue Ryder started a home in Germany, housing these people until she could decide how to help them. They were looking for a nurse to look after them. She could be difficult, very demanding, expected of us all what she herself was prepared to give. There was no money about. We did a lot of fundraising, so we had a very meagre diet. So we used to have musical evenings in the drawing room where there was a piano, and one of the patients played the piano. Now he had arthritis and his hands were like this. He came from the aristocracy of Czechoslovakia. But I suddenly thought one day, if he could use his arms, he could play a trombone, no hands needed. And I bought one for him and he played it.
Well, and the musical evenings, they were all right, because someone playing the piano and some, and us lot singing, it all went down very well.
We have now come to the end of the second episode of podcast, Never Standing Still, retelling the story of Sue Ryder. I think you'll probably understand now why the podcast has that title. Sue comes across as a determined person and single-minded in her drive to right the wrongs done to a group of war survivors who helped the Allies achieve victory at great personal cost, a cost that did not get any less once victory had come. I think this unconventional situation called for an unconventional person to understand and help. If you wish to read further, here are the books that have informed this podcast episode. Lady Ryder's autobiography, Child of My Love. Biography, But Some There Be, by A.J. Forrest. The Lady Ryder of Warsaw Memorial Trust have produced a record of Sue Ryder's work to mark her centenary year. Sue Ryder, A Life Lived for Others, by Joanna Bogle. Find out more on their website. In our next and final episode, I will talk more about Sue's life and work, its expansion at home and overseas, and a change in focus, and the work of the Lady Ryder of Warsaw Memorial Trust. Please do subscribe or follow our podcast to be notified about the next episode. You can also follow the Lady Ryder of Warsaw Memorial Trust on social media, at Lady Ryder Trust on Instagram, and Twitter, Lady Ryder of Warsaw Memorial Trust on Facebook, or their website, https://www.lrwmt.org.uk to find out more about their work.